In the American Midwest, nestled in the rolling hills of Iowa, there's a small, quiet town called Villisca. Its history is a lot like thousands of other small towns, written in the stories of its families, its churches, and its quiet, tree-lined streets. But on one night, over a century ago, that history was violently rewritten in blood. In 1912, an entire family and their two young guests were slaughtered in their beds with an axe. The crime was brutal. The investigation was a mess, and the killer was never caught. At least that's the official story. But what if the official story is a lie? What if the reason this horrific case is still unsolved isn't because of a phantom killer who vanished into the night? What if it's because the most powerful people in town knew exactly who the murderer was, and they let him get away with it? This isn't just the story of an unsolved massacre. This is the story of a town with a secret so dark it was worth protecting a monster. To really understand the horror that hit Villisca, you have to understand the world it shattered. In 1912, Villisca, Iowa was the very picture of small-town American life. It was a place with about 2,000 people where everyone knew each other's business deals were done on a handshake and life revolved around church and social events. By all accounts, it was a good place to live, a safe place to raise a family. And right at the heart of that community was the Moore family. Josiah B. Moore, who was 43, was living the American dream. He was a successful, respected businessman known for being sharp and hardworking. After years of working for the town's most prominent figure, a state senator named Frank F. Jones, Josiah had struck out on his own. He opened his own farm implement store, and in a move that would seal his fate, he snagged the hugely profitable John Deere franchise right out from under his old boss. His business was booming, and he'd built a good life for his family in a modest white house on East 2nd Street. His wife Sarah, 39, was as beloved as her husband was respected. She was a pillar of the local Presbyterian church, a dedicated mother, and the warm, steady center of her family's world. Together, they were raising 4 bright, happy kids, Herman the oldest at 11, Mary Catherine a thoughtful 10-year-old, and the 2 little boys, 7-year-old Arthur and 5-year-old Paul. The Moore house was known as a place full of laughter and energy. The children were popular and active in the church, and their home was always open to friends and neighbors. They were the ideal family in an ideal town. They were well-liked, doing well for themselves, and deeply woven into the fabric of Villisca life. They had no known enemies, no dark secrets that anyone knew about. Their life was just a simple routine of faith and small-town joys. It was this deep sense of normal, this picture of total peace, that made what happened next not just a tragedy, but something so evil it suggested the darkness didn't come from outside, but had been festering inside Villisca all along. Sunday, June 9th, 1912, was a special day at the Villisca Presbyterian Church. It was the annual Children's Day, an event mostly organized and led by Sarah Moore. The evening service was the big finish to weeks of practice, a chance for the kids of the congregation to take center stage, sing songs, and recite poems. The church was packed with proud parents and neighbors, buzzing with the sweet energy of the children's performances. The Moore family was right at the heart of it all. Sarah, the proud organizer, watched as her own children performed. 10-year-old Mary Catherine recited a piece she had memorized, her voice ringing through the chapel. The whole family, Josiah, Sarah, Herman, Catherine, Arthur, and Paul was all there sitting together. Two sisters, Ina, 8, and Lena Stillinger, 12, were also there. They were friends with the Moore children and had been in the program. As the event wrapped up around 9:30 p.m., the church was full of cheerful goodbyes. The Stillinger girls, still buzzing from the excitement, asked their parents if they could spend the night at the Moores. It was a simple, innocent request between friends in a town where nobody had any reason to fear their neighbors. Permission was granted. The girls would walk home with the Moores and come back to their own house the next morning. The group of 8, the 6 Moores, and the 2 Stillinger sisters left the church together. They walked through the darkening streets of Villisca, a short, familiar journey home. The air was probably filled with the kids' chatter about the night's show, full of the simple joy of a sleepover to come. They got to the little white house on East 2nd Street sometime between 9:45 and 10:00 p.m. The family and their guests had some milk and cookies, a quiet end to a long day. Then they all got ready for bed. Josiah and Sarah went to their bedroom upstairs. The 4 more children went to their own rooms on the same floor. Downstairs in the guest bedroom, right off the parlor, Mary Catherine and the Stillinger sisters, Ina and Lena, settled in for the night. The house grew quiet. The lights went out. The family and the entire town of Villisca fell into a peaceful, unsuspecting sleep. It was the last peace the Moore family would ever know, and the last true peace Villisca would see for generations. Sometime between midnight and dawn, a figure carrying Josiah Moore's own axe would move silently through the house, turning a home into a slaughterhouse. Monday, June 10th, started bright and clear, just a typical Iowa summer morning. The town of Villisca began to stir, but at the Moore house there was an unnatural stillness. The house stayed shut tight. The curtains were all drawn. There were no kids playing in the yard, no sign of Josiah heading to work. The first to notice something was wrong was the Moore's next-door neighbor, Mary Peckham. As the morning went on, she got more and more uneasy. The Moores were early risers, a family of habit. This silence was unsettling. She tried calling their house, but no one answered. She walked over and knocked on the door. Still no answer. She tried to look in a window, but cloths had been hung over the glass from the inside. By mid-morning, Peckham's concern turned to real alarm. She called Josiah's brother Ross Moore, a local druggist, and told him about the silent house. Ross came over, and when his own knocks went unanswered, he found the right key on his ring and unlocked the front door. The house was dark inside, with every window covered. Ross stepped into the parlor and called out his brother's name. The only answer was a heavy, oppressive silence. He walked toward the downstairs guest bedroom. He pushed the door open. The room was dim. On the bed, he could make out 2 small shapes under a blood-soaked sheet. He didn't need to see any more. He stumbled back out of the house and told Mary Peckham, his voice trembling. Wrong. Get the sheriff. Town Marshal Henry Hank Horton arrived around 8:30 a.m. and went inside. What he found confirmed the absolute horror Ross Moore had only glimpsed. Upstairs, he found Josiah and Sarah Moore in their bed, their heads crushed. In the other rooms, he found the 4 Moore children, Herman, Catherine, Arthur, and Paul, all murdered in their beds. Back downstairs, he formally identified the 2 small bodies Ross had seen, Ina and Lena Stillinger. All 8 people had been bludgeoned to death with an axe. The peace of Villisca hadn't just been broken, it had been annihilated. The news tore through the town, and with it came shocked grief and a terrifying question: who could have done this? The discovery of the 8 bodies was just the beginning of the nightmare. What followed was a second tragedy, the complete destruction of the crime scene. In 1912, forensic science was barely a thing, especially in a small town. Concepts like preserving a crime scene were not common practice. What happened at the Moore House was a catastrophic failure, a failure so total you have to wonder, was it just incompetence or was it deliberate? Marshal Horton did little to secure the house after his initial search. As word of the massacre spread, a morbid curiosity took over the town. Soon, a crowd gathered, and then, inexplicably, they were allowed inside. Not just a few people, but dozens, maybe even over 100. They walked through the blood-spattered rooms, trampling over potential evidence, their hands touching everything. The scene became less of an investigation and more of a public spectacle, a circus of chaos that erased any real chance of finding clean evidence. The killer's tracks were buried under the footprints of half the town. It wasn't until around noon that the National Guard showed up to finally secure the house, but by then the damage was done. Still, there were strange clues left behind. Every mirror in the house had been covered with cloths. A bowl of bloody water was found in the kitchen, suggesting the killer had tried to wash up before leaving. And maybe weirdest of all, 2 slabs of raw bacon were found on the floor of the downstairs bedroom, wrapped in a dish towel next to a small piece of a keychain. The killer, after this brutal frenzy, had lingered. He had taken the time to cover the mirrors, which some see as a sign of remorse or superstition. He had washed his hands. Some disputed reports even claimed 2 spent cigarettes were found in the attic, suggesting he might have waited there for the family to come home. Then he locked the door behind him and vanished. The contaminated scene meant investigators had to rely on these bizarre ritualistic clues and witness testimony. It forced them to look not at what the killer left behind, but who the killer might be. And as they did, the investigation turned away from some random drifter and toward the dark undercurrents of Villisca itself. In the desperate hunt for a monster, investigators soon focused on a man who was by all accounts very strange, Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly. Kelly was an English traveling preacher, known for being small and having an intense, often unsettling way about him. He had a history of mental illness and a reputation for inappropriate behavior, including accusations of being a peeping Tom. He was an outsider who just didn't fit in. Crucially, Reverend Kelly was in Villisca on the night of the murders. He had spoken at the same Children's Day service the Moore family attended. Then, in a highly suspicious move, he left town on a train at 5 a.m. the next morning hours, before the bodies were found. His behavior after the murders only made him look guiltier. He became obsessed with the crime, writing long letters to investigators and showing a strange fascination with the details. Witnesses claimed they had overheard Kelly on the train discussing the murders before the news had even officially broken. And most damningly, he sent a blood-stained shirt to a laundry shortly after the killings. 5 years later, in 1917, Kelly was arrested. After a long, brutal interrogation, the fragile preacher confessed. He claimed a voice from God had commanded him to slay utterly everyone in the house. It looked like the case was finally solved. But the confession was shaky. It was obtained under extreme pressure, and Kelly took it back almost immediately, saying he'd been forced into it. He was tried twice. The first trial ended with a hung jury, and the second ended in a quick acquittal. The evidence against him was all circumstantial. The bloody shirt, he said it was from a shaving cut. The confession on the train, it came from witnesses whose memories were hazy. Reverend Kelly walked free. To some, he's still the most likely killer. But to others, was he just the perfect scapegoat? A creepy outsider that a terrified town could blame, distracting everyone from a truth much closer to home. The mystery of the Villisca axe murders is a maze of secrets and lies, and we're just getting started. If you're as fascinated by this case as I am and you want to see more investigations that challenge the official story, take a second to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Now let's turn to the suspect that the people of Villisca were whispering about from the very beginning. While police were chasing Reverend Kelly, many people in Villisca had already made up their minds about who was really responsible. Their suspicions didn't point to a drifter or a preacher, but to the most powerful man in town, State Senator Frank Fernando Jones. From the moment the news broke, his name was on everyone's lips. Frank F. Jones was the definition of a local powerhouse. He was a rich businessman, a respected politician, and a man you did not want to cross. And Josiah Moore hadn't just crossed him, he had professionally humiliated him. For 9 years, Josiah worked for Jones, but in 1907, he opened a competing business right across the street. Then he went a step further. Josiah managed to snag the exclusive John Deere franchise, taking a huge piece of business directly from his former boss. In a small town, this was basically a declaration of war. Frank Jones, a man used to getting his way, was reportedly furious. That was a strong motive for hate, but the rumors in Villisca suggested another more personal one. Gossip spread by telephone operators who listened in on calls claimed that Josiah Moore was having an affair with Jones's daughter-in-law, Donna. Whether it was true or not, the rumor itself was damaging. If it got back to Frank F. Jones, a man obsessed with his family's reputation, it would have been an unforgivable betrayal. Of course, nobody thought the 57-year-old senator swung the axe himself. The theory was far more chilling that Frank Jones hired a hitman to eliminate Josiah Moore, and the hitman was told to leave no witnesses. This theory offers a terrifyingly plausible reason for why the case was never solved. How could you investigate a crime when the main suspect is the most powerful man in the region? A private detective named James Wilkerson became convinced of this theory and openly accused Jones of orchestrating the murders. A grand jury was eventually convened to investigate Jones, but it refused to indict him. He was never arrested and denied everything until the day he died. But the suspicion never went away. The Jones theory could explain the bungled crime scene. Maybe the chaos was allowed to happen to cover the tracks of a professional killer. It could explain why so much time and money was spent chasing an outsider like Reverend Kelly, the perfect diversion. And it paints a picture of a town paralyzed by fear, where people knew the truth, but were too scared to say it out loud, where justice took a back seat to power. If Senator Jones was the mastermind, then who actually held the axe? Detective Wilkerson had a name for that too: William Blackie Mansfield. Mansfield was a violent man, a killer for hire, who seemed to fit the part perfectly. Wilkerson's investigation linked him to a string of terrifyingly similar crimes. He was the main suspect in the axe murders of his own wife, baby, and in-laws in Illinois 2 years after Villisca. Wilkerson believed Mansfield was a serial killer whose services were bought by Frank Jones. The case seemed to get stronger when an inmate in a Kansas prison claimed Mansfield had confessed to him, saying he was paid $2,000 for the Villisca job. Based on Wilkerson's work, a grand jury was convened in 1916 and Blackie Mansfield was arrested. But then the case fell apart. Mansfield produced what authorities called a rock-solid alibi. Payroll records from his job in Illinois supposedly proved he was hundreds of miles away when the murders happened. The grand jury refused to indict him, and he was released. Mansfield then turned around and sued Detective Wilkerson for defamation, winning a settlement. For those who believed the Jones theory, this wasn't proof of innocence, but proof of a cover-up. How did a guy like Mansfield produce such a perfect alibi? Was it real? Or was it bought and paid for by the same powerful man who hired him? Wilkerson certainly thought so. The intense focus on men like Kelly and Mansfield seems even stranger when you consider other suspects who were quickly dismissed, like a drifter named Andrew Sawyer. He was briefly held after being overheard discussing the murders with a strange amount of detail, but he was quickly let go. It seemed the people in charge were determined to focus on specific stories, leaving the truth buried under a pile of contradictions, ruined evidence, and one very convenient alibi. In the century since the murders, another theory has gained traction, one that pulls away from the local drama of Villisca and suggests something much bigger. This is the man from the train theory, made popular by researchers Bill James and his daughter Rachel McCarthy James. They argue that the Villisca murders weren't a one-off event, but part of a long chain of nearly identical slaughters that happened across the country between the late 1890s and 1912. They spotted a pattern: a family is killed in their beds with their own axe, always in a house near railroad tracks. The killer covers the victims' faces and any mirrors, locks the door, and disappears, probably by hopping on the next train out of town. The similarities to Villisca are impossible to ignore. The Moore home was near the tracks. An axe was used. Faces and mirrors were covered. This theory suggests the killer was a traveling serial murderer, a ghost who drifted from town to town, leaving horror in his wake. The researchers even proposed a possible name for this phantom: Paul Muller, a German immigrant who was the only suspect in a similar family murder in 1897, but was never caught. It must be stated, however, that Muller's connection is purely speculative. This theory is powerful because it explains the bizarre ritualistic details of the crime and how a killer could strike and vanish without a trace. It offers an answer that doesn't rely on local conspiracies, but it doesn't quite explain away the strange circumstances of the Villisca investigation. Even if a traveling serial killer swung the axe, it doesn't account for the immediate and lasting rumors about Frank F. Jones or the town's strange paralysis. Maybe the man from the train committed the murders, but that doesn't mean powerful figures in Villisca didn't use the chaos of his terrible act to make sure the investigation looked everywhere but in their own backyard. The failure to convict anyone for the murder of 8 people, 6 of them children, left a permanent scar on Villisca. The acquittals of Kelly and the dismissal of charges against men like Jones and Mansfield didn't bring closure. They just bred more suspicion and division. The community, once united in grief, fractured. Neighbors eyed each other with distrust. Was the man you saw at the store a friend, or had he gotten away with murder? The trials had been messy, laying bare all the town's secrets, rumors of affairs, bitter rivalries, and the dark side of a supposedly perfect town. With no justice, these secrets didn't go away. They festered. For decades, the murders became a taboo topic, something easier to bury than to face. But the whispers never stopped. The story was passed down through generations, a grim local legend and a constant reminder of an unpaid debt. This legacy of silence is maybe the most compelling evidence that the truth was known and deliberately suppressed. An unsolved murder by a mysterious drifter is a tragedy. But an unsolved murder where the killer might be one of your own, a man with the power to enforce silence, is a conspiracy. The investigation's failure wasn't just about a lack of science, it was a failure of will. The town of Villisca didn't just forget. Perhaps it was forced to look away. The truth became too dangerous, and a heavy silence fell, a silence that felt less like peace and more like a surrender. While the living tried to bury the memory of that night, the house on East 2nd Street has refused to forget. In the years since, the modest white home has earned a new dark reputation. It's known as one of the most haunted places in America. The house, now restored to its 1912 condition and open for tours and overnight stays, is a pilgrimage site for paranormal investigators and ghost hunters. The stories from visitors are consistent and chilling. People report hearing the disembodied voices of children crying or whispering. Doors open and close on their own. Objects move, and apparitions have allegedly been seen, especially in the upstairs children's bedroom. A falling lamp pushed by an unseen force is a common report. Many visitors talk about an overwhelming feeling of sadness and a heavy oppressive energy that fills the entire house. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, the haunting of the Villisca Axe murder house is a powerful metaphor for the unresolved injustice of the case. The restless spirits said to walk its halls are the echoes of a story without an ending, a crime without a punishment. They are the echoes of 8 lives cut short their final moments trapped within the walls of their home. The house itself has become the keeper of the secret. It stands as a monument to the crime, its silence screaming the truth that the town was forced to whisper. The paranormal activity, real or imagined, makes sure the victims aren't forgotten. The house remembers what happened. It remembers the children who went to sleep and never woke up. And maybe it remembers the face of the man who held the axe, a face that may have been all too familiar to the people of Villisca. Over 100 years later, the Villisca Axe murders remain officially unsolved. The case is a chilling story of brutal violence, failed justice, and secrets that refuse to die. So who did it? Was it the mentally ill Reverend Kelly acting on a bloody command from God? Was it a nameless serial killer? The man from the train who chose his victims at random and simply disappeared? Or was the truth much darker and much closer to home? Was the slaughter of 8 people the result of a small-town feud that spiraled into an act of unspeakable revenge planned by a powerful state senator who was above the law? Was the killer a man whose identity was an open secret, but whose power guaranteed his freedom and the town's silence? The evidence is long gone and the witnesses are dead. But the questions hang over that small Iowa town like a permanent shadow. And it forces us to ask one last disturbing question. What's more terrifying, a monster who comes from the outside or one who lives among you, protected by the very community he terrorized? Let me know what you believe in the comments below.